Hello, ladies and gents. Happy last Saturday of the month. Happy last Saturday of October. We're on the module DD211, understanding politics, ideas, and institutions in the modern world. I want to influence you for today. Young teenagers, young adults, mature adults. When doing your assignments for any academics that you're trying to do, always reference your reading. Where is the book printed? The Open University, Walton Hall, Milton Keynes, MK76AA, first published 2015, second edition 2022, The Open University. We're on page 204, power. Who has the power? Who has the most power in society? Prime Minister and the King. Prime Minister shakes the King's hand. He takes the executive position of authority over land. Some may argue that authorities have power, such as police have the authoritative right to stop and search. A social worker, a socialist worker, has the authority to look after your health and well-being, to interact with your work life if you're not well fit to work, for instance. Some armed forces have a authoritative right to look after radicalisation throughout society. Anyway, let's have a look at chapter 7, power. Who do you think has more power here? The riot police officers with their guns, armour, and strength in numbers racing towards her, or the solitary female protester who peacefully stands before them unbowed? It may seem at the face value that the riot police have the power. The explicit power over others that comes from possessing weapons and shields. But the image of the protester dressed for a summer's day, standing resolutely upright as the police seem to stumble before her, unsure. It possesses a visual and symbolic impact. The image spread around the world via the internet, and its impacts might be considered to outweigh the violence perpetrated by riot police officers that day in terms of power. The image of the protester, Aisha Evans, a nurse, has come to symbolise the idea of peaceful protest in a battle against the domination of racial injustice and violent repossession. Hannah Arendt was a Jewish political theorist who escaped the terror of Nazi Germany in the 1930s and wrote about the dangers of authoritarianism and totalitarianism. Arendt, 1970, argued that the power by domination and physical force, as seen in the actions of the riot policemen above, is actually a sign of loss of power. Power, too, is the idea that power can instead be productive, creative, potential capacity that belongs to people and groups. For Arendt, it is an approach to studying power that emphasises the possibilities of bringing about desired outcomes. Arendt challenges the idea that power is simply observable in the dominant actions of political leaders or great armies. The idea expressed by Mao Tse-tung, the power grows out of the barrel of the gun, quoted in Arendt, 1970. Of course, it would be foolish not to recognise the power of modern coercive military technology and the dominance, or power over, at least a force to certain state actors and achieve aims in the short term. But Arendt persuasively argues that lasting power is found in power too, the capacity of groups acting together and not of powerful individuals with the fingers of tear gas, spray guns, or nuclear triggers. To Arendt, power corresponds to the human ability not just to act, but to act in concert. Power is never the property of an individual. It belongs to a group and remains in existence only so long as that group keeps together. Arendt, 1970, page 44. The example of the non-violent resistance movement against British rule in India in the first half of the 20th century illustrates this idea of power too. Throughout this period, The actual member of British colonial rulers was far outweighed by the indigenous population, but the British were able to hold power over colonised Indian people based on their superior weaponry, technology, and bureaucratic systems of organisations. So, how can we explain their ultimate defeat and withdrawal from India? Arden argued that the power of the resistance movement to the British rule lay in the power to act together. Mahatma Gandhi realised that if India was to be freed from British rule, it wouldn't simply be a matter of overcoming the physical change. It was also necessary to raise consciousness within Indian society regarding the inherent injustice of colonialism. In a battle of military force, British power would win, but in a battle of ideas, the British could lose. Gandhi's non-violent, non-cooperation movement encapsulates this idea of power too, as a power to act together and demonstrates the potential to bring about change in the face of a better equipped opponent. Whilst Gandhi's approach to politics is often characterised as passive resistance, this could be further from the truth. Gandhi's non-cooperation movement was active, not passive, and his movement took part in multiple campaigns of civil disobedience, boycotts, and direct action, such as the Salt March. The Salt March drew attention to the oppressive nature of British rule, highlighting that even a simple act of extracting salt through natural process was subject to imposition of taxes by the foreign rulers. Gandhi led to 240-mile protests, marched to sea, and once there, he and his followers took part in the traditional process of producing salt by the evaporation of seawater. Afterwards, Gandhi and his followers symbolically refused to pay the salt tax over to the British rulers. Gandhi's idea lived on beyond particular circumstances of British colonialism in India and have some influential, more widely symbolic of the power to act together can endanger. Hannah's Arden makes a critical point that such non-violent strategies on the part of oppressed groups can only work in certain contexts. She notes that if Gandhi's enormously powerful and successful strategy of non-violent resistance had met with a different enemy, Stalin's Russia, Hitler's Germany, even pre-war Japan instead of Britain, the outcome would not have been decolonisation but massacre and submission. What this section has shown is that power is not simply to be understood in terms of the ability to deploy physical force, as power over to ensure compliance with your wishes. Brute force can be countered with the power of ideas, of non-violence and acting together. Further, Arden's argument that power needs to be based on the people's consent if it is to be a lasting form of power is a persuasive one and makes a strong case for involving people in the process of their government. The idea of power as a capacity or potential presents a clear focus upon the way that individuals and groups can act to bring about desired outcomes. Nevertheless, for Stephen Luce, a contemporary political theorist, this approach doesn't account for the most important workings of power. He makes a strong case that what is critical to any workings of power. He makes a strong case that what is critical to any study of power is not power to, but rather power over. He argued that power too is only identifiable in retrospect. Once a group has achieved power over, for example, Luke would hold that until India's independence. The power of Gandhi and his followers were negligible. A fourth section examines Luke's three-dimensional approach to power. The dimensions of power. The influential study, Power Racial View, Luke's focus on what he calls the conflictual aspect of power, the fact that it is exercised over people. In order to help explain how power works in practice, Luke develops ideas that power has three dimensions. The first dimension is overt power. The dimension sees power as property that belongs to individuals. Power they can exercise explicitly over others, for instance. A politician making decisions in Parliament has power over others. The dimension sees power out to the open, visible and diversible. The second dimension is covert power. The dimension suggests that power is often less visible than in the first dimension, covert. Power can be found in being able to decide what gets decided, effectively by keeping certain issues of the agenda. An illustration might be a big multinational company seeking to keep its poor environmental record out of the news and out of the policymaking discussions. Third dimension is power over thoughts and desires. The dimension suggests that power can be even less viable than in the second dimension. It suggests that people can be manipulated and holding views that go against what is their real interest. Instead, the use of power can cause people to assume positions that misguidedly support those who exercise power over them. Here, the examples of censorship and political advertising illustrate how powerful entities attempt to shape our attitudes and desires. As you can see, all three dimensions emphasize power over. Luke's ideas, which draw on contributions from the political scientists, have been influential in the study of power because they allow us to appreciate the various ways that power can operate in politics. In all three dimensions, there are people and groups who hold power and exercise it over others. The first dimension of power, avert power. The first dimension is avert power. Power can cause something to happen internationally, such as a driver following the instructions of a policeman, or a population obeying a particular law made by politicians. In Parliament, power is a property of individuals and groups and is apparent and a capacity to modify the behaviour of their individuals and groups. Political power is evident in its successful exercise found in concrete decision made in the effect of a community. The important aspect here is that power is out in the open, visible and observable in relation between people, hence avert power. Stephen Luke identifies this dimension in the work of Robert Dahl, a political scientist writing in the 1950s who set out his initiative. Common sense conception of power as a power over B to the extent that he can get B to do something that B would not otherwise do. For example, a politician makes a decision to raise the tax on petrol. It causes the car user to pay more tax than he would otherwise. They'll focus his influential study, who governs, on the community of Haven, Connecticut, in the US. He wanted to get as close as possible to decisions that affect people's life most obviously, such as the decisions that affect education of children. His investigation sought to establish whether the powerful ruling elite were able to achieve their own interest at the expense of others, or whether leaders actually listened to their constituents and made decisions that were in their constituents' interests. He was interested in the minutiae of decision making, such as regarding policy making in government-run schools. Here is a taste of his findings. A few people, the leaders, evidently exerted great direct influence on a series of decisions about teacher salaries, appointments, habitations, buildings. But some of these leaders were elected to the office because parents and teachers expressed their discontent with existing policy by voting against the incumbent. The winning candidate, together with other leaders, helped to activate the channel discontent. Had they done so, it might have lain smouldering much longer. As you can begin to see, Dow found that the community leaders were not simply pressing their wishes upon constituents in a top-down imposition, but rather they had to compete for the votes of constituents. This led politicians to uncover grievances and build coalitions of support in order to help them challenge and overthrow rival incumbents who clearly weren't listening to their constituents. Dahl's wider conclusion. What was that within the US democratic system? Leaders competed for the support of the electorate, and this ensured that no identifiable group was able to dominate the decision-making process to the exclusion of all other groups. It didn't mean that ruling elites did not exist, but that such groups didn't simply get their own way, as democratic processes generally would not allow this to happen. Leaders had to keep an ear open to those who elected them, and this is entailed building coalitions of support for any particular policy. As such, Dale takes a rather optimistic view on democratic practices, one that emphasizes the openness of democracy. But this kind of approach to studying power could also be open to finding corruption or domination if the evidence pointed in that direction. What this first dimension seeks to establish is that power is very much a thing that exists in its exercise. It is something that can be observed and identified. Power is a property of individuals, and they exercise this over other individuals. Through overt power over, the second dimension suggests that power might not be so open to observation, that it might be more hidden. The second dimension of power, covert power. The second dimension of covert power, the power that allows power interests to decide what gets onto the agenda and what stays off the agenda, which issues and policies are discussed, and importantly, which are not. The understanding of power might look at political debate in Parliament or in the media to identify the ways in which a debate is limited to discussing safe issues that don't damage the interests of powerful groups. This is a form of power over once more, and though it is possible to observe if one knows where to look, in general it is less obvious and more hidden form, hence covert power. The second dimension of power draws attention to the importance of non-decisions. The idea of power isn't just about getting what you want in an open contest of power, as in the first dimension, but might also be found in being able to keep the important conflicts of interest that exist within society hidden from those whose interests are being damaged. The example of climate change illustrates that covert power. 210. Power can keep what might be termed the interests of society hidden away from everyday political debate and decision making. David Attenborough, known for his BBC Nature documentary, told the United Nations Security Council in 2021 that climate change was the biggest threat to security that modern humans have ever faced. United Nations 2021. At the same event, Prime Minister Boris Johnson asked the Council, if we don't act now, when will we act? This is chilling stuff. If Attenborough is right, the idea that climate change is the biggest threat to security in modern history would seem to warrant a concerted effort by policymakers to take urgent action. Indeed, the evidence for climate change is now overwhelming. The Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, an independent body made up of scientists from around the world, state in its report of 2021 that it is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean and land. In particular, the burning of fossil fuels such as coal, oil and gas has caused a greenhouse effect, warming the planet. The IPCC observed that human-induced climate change is causing weather extremes around the world, from heat waves and droughts to wildfires, floods and cyclones. The melting of polar ice caps and glaciers will cause sea levels to rise further in devastating coastal areas. Unless by 2050 governments can reduce carbon monoxide emissions to net zero, when the amount of greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere is balanced by when the amount of greenhouse gas going into the atmosphere is balanced by the amount of removed, then substantial parts of the world will become uninhabitable. This will force potentially hundreds of millions of people to migrate, causing misery and major geopolitical uncertainty. Yet many politicians seem unwilling or unable to take the kind of urgent action necessary to counter the effects of global warming, like cutting fossil fuels emissions. If this is a crisis of world historical significance, why are they not doing more? Some campaigners have become impatient with what they perceive to be empty promises. As Greta Thunberg told young climate activists, green economy, blah, 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 net zero by 2050, blah, blah, blah. This is all we hear from our so-called leaders. Words that sound great, but so far not led to action. Thunberg quoted in Carrington 2021. The second dimension of power might be able to shed some light on this problem of political inaction. Peter Bechart and Morton Barat, in their study Two Faces of Power, point to a critical capacity of people in power, namely the ability to decide what gets discussed, when and by whom. While they concede that in a democracy people can engage with issues that are on the agenda, this doesn't explain why some less important issues are on the agenda and why other significant matters aren't. Why is it that some of the most important issues in society are simply brushed under the carpet? Climate scientist Michael Mann has argued that fossil fuel lobbyists have for decades subtly sought to sow doubt and confusion about climate change. In exchange for secretive funding to election campaigns, politicians postpone urgent political action for another year or decade, while presenting positive action as largely an individual lifestyle choice for which we are responsible, thereby absolving wealthy polluters of culpability. And if we are, as consumers, are happy to use energy produced by fossil fuels and not pressure our politicians much about the environmental consequences, Convert Power can be said to have successfully covered over the issue of climate change. Power is operating, but it is not contested. Business as usual prevails. Page 211. Yet you might feel as at the stage that early climate change is on the agenda. It's something that everyone is familiar with and as an idea as a political potential threat. You might also contend that not all powerful companies are being able to keep their interests of the agenda and convert all the time. Advocates of the second dimension would acknowledge these points, but insist that we should be interested in outcomes in actual political debates regarding politics. Why is it a particular power station built despite the evidence of global warming? Why do governments continue to build new airports and roads for fossil fuel, burning vehicles to use? In short, why isn't urgent climate change action truly at the top of the agenda? The issue of the primary concern in the second dimension of covert power is how the issues come to regard as a point while others do not. The argument is that political processes themselves allow for domination actors to shape and control the agenda, to put things off and to keep the interest away from public scrutiny. The third dimension of power, power over thoughts and desires. The third dimension of power focuses on how people come to perceive and understand what is in their interests. The first two dimensions offer clear insight into how dimensions are made or not made, but perhaps they don't tell us a great deal about what motivates people to adopt the political position that they do, except perhaps an assumption that people act out of rational perception of their interests. Luke argues that most effective and insidious use of power is to prevent conflict from arising in the first place. Power might be on the terms of what is regarded as a common sense, which limits the boundaries of what counts as a political issue. At the heart of Luke's third dimension is a radical question of the origin and nature of people's thoughts and desires. Power, according to this analysis, is a force that acts to shape these thoughts and desires, and is effective when people come to see the power that is exercised over them as being in line with their own interests and wishes. Power in the third dimension is the power to mislead. Luke argues that power manufacturers gain consent, that they create the support of a general population by manipulating their attitudes and desires. Luke formulates this form of power as A exercise power over B by influencing, shaping, or determining his very wants. To Luke, some third dimension works at the level of their subjective interest. Power here causing us not to notice the way we are manipulated by powerful interests, or else to perceive of the status quo as natural, in line with our interests, or inevitable. As Luke asked, it is not supreme exercise of power to get another or others to have their desires you want to have. That is to secure their compliance by controlling their thoughts and desires. In figure 4, the first image of a long figure wearing a white shirt and facing up to a line of masked ducks may seem an odd one until you look at the second image and realise that the duck had been superimposed over images of tanks. This is a version of the iconic image that came to symbolise the events in and around the Tiananmen Square in Beijing, China, on the 4th of June, when it is estimated that at least 1,000 peaceful pro-democracy demonstrators were killed by the Chinese military under the command of the authoritarian government. You can see the power of the non-violence as an idea working again here. A powerful, so proactive that the Chinese government continues to feel that it needs to close down the debate. To control the thoughts of its people, the Great Firewall of China is one of the world's most elaborate mechanisms of thought control, which attempts to shut down any mention of popular protest in dissent with China by policing and censoring the internet. If you were to type Tiananmen Square or even 1989 into Chinese search engine, you generally would not receive any meaningful results. This has led to innovative dissenters to think of more elaborate ways to avoid the censor, such as using the date 65 April rather than 4th of June. However, quickly and dissenters developed new ways of avoiding the thought of control. The authorities act to close them down. The duck tank image is one of the most famous and ingenious examples that measures taken to avoid the censors. Examples of extreme measures taken to close down the dissent and control thought in order to render opposition unthinkable was an essential feature of George Orwell's political novel 1984, the idea of securing compliance by controlling their thoughts and desires. Is threaded throughout Orwell's story. The main character, a government clerk called Winston Smith, works in the Ministry of Truth, busily rewriting history and amending newspaper articles from the past that contain stories that the present government finds uncomfortable or out of line with their current priorities. In this novel, the government is intent on controlling, manipulating, and shaping the ideas and practices of its people. In order to achieve total control, the thought itself is targeted and reshaped. The dictionary is rewritten, and a new language, new speak, is created that makes certain thoughts impossible. For example, to translate the entire phrase, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and in a new speak would require just one word, crime think. But it is simply in authoritarian regimes, imaginary or real, that attempts to manipulate the thoughts of population take place. The third dimension of power also allows us to explore the way that political interests set out to manipulate the voting population in liberal democracies, turning politics into a product to be sold like any other consumer brand. Labour isn't working. Conservative political campaign poster in the 1979 election. The election of Margaret Thatcher in the UK in 1979 was accompanied by the infamous campaigner protester from the advertising agency Saatchi and Saatchi, shown in figure 5. It was a very powerful image, purporting to show a mass cross-section of the public queuing up in the unemployment office. In fact, it is around 20 Conservative supporters photographed several times in different positions within the image, spliced together in order to make it look like a convincing queue. Dennis Healey, a senior Labour politician at the time, complained that the advert amounted to selling politics like soap powder. BBC News 2001. Of course, it's difficult to measure the effect that a single advert will have on voters, but some senior Conservative figures believed that this advert helped win the election for the Conservative Party. In this example, we can see all the three dimensions working at once. The overt public contest for power is apparent in the electoral process. Through parties competing to win votes, the covert agenda set of power of a second dimension might be apparent in what is absent from the debate, for instance. Why is the unemployment on the agenda and not some other issue? Luke's third dimension, the manipulation of people's perception of their interests, is also present. The image itself is manipulated to create a false impression. Moreover, the power doesn't tell you why you should vote Conservative, apart from telling you that you should vote Conservative because it is in Labour. There is an element of fear and insecurity being conveyed here. Vote Labour and lose your job is the message. Following an election, the manipulation of public opinion quickly became apparent as unemployment levels doubled under incoming Conservative government, rising from 1.5 million to over 3 million. Anyone persuaded into voting Conservative in 1979 on a particular issue of rising unemployment could certainly be said to have been misled. This is just one example, and the practice of negative campaigning is now an established feature of nearly all democracies. But this type of manipulation can only be partially successful, partially in liberal democracies with freedom of the press. Since in future elections, the public may be less willing to trust the words of politicians, leading to these politicians losing some of their power to mislead. Indeed, Luke himself concludes somewhat more optimistically that this form of power is never, except in fictional dystopias, more than partially effective. The example of the measures taken by Chinese descendants to avoid the thought control of the senses seems to back up this argument. In the third dimension of power, desires and thoughts are manipulated. We are made to believe in the normality, rightness, goodness, or at least the inevitability of our own domination. Power is being applied in this dimension against what is the objective interest of those who are dominated by the processes. Power is most affected when it is invisible or taken for granted. That's just the way things are. The late cultural theorist Mark Fisher called the effect that capitalist realism, and a sense that at the end of the Cold War, capitalism came to totally occupy the horizons of the thinkable. Any alternative form of political or economic system has become many around the world unimaginable, he argued. While not all will share his preference for a post-capitalist future, it points to the ways in which power can be used to conceal the activity of the elites who possess it. The rule of establishment is presented as naturalized, inevitable, and beyond contestation. Page 217. Social power and a fourth dimension. Power is everywhere. Power comes from below. Michael Foucault, a philosopher and historian, has had a profound impact upon contemporary approaches to the study of power. What Foucault provides an explanation of how power is not simply exerted by powerful individuals, groups, or institutions, but is rather a fact in all social relations. He can be seen as extending the analysis of power beyond the remit Luke set itself. Foucault recognises how social structures such as work, education, health embedded and reproduce inequalities, material advantages and disadvantages, privileges and deprivation. Not only are the individual's particular life chances and opportunities shaped by these social structures, but so is the way they see themselves and others in this earlier work. Foucault focused on the role of institutional settings such as the madhouse, the prison, and the clinic. But while individuals are indeed products of these social structures, they also constitute them. They make them remake them through everyday routines. This is what Foucault means when he suggests the power comes from below. For Foucault, power does not operate most simply from above, from government and the state. This is just one particular form of political power, but perhaps a privileged one. Among a varied fields of power sources, sometimes overlapping, sometimes not, power is apparent in all human relationships, as these relations of power are inextricably entwined with knowledge. Who gets to determine what is true? When we go to see the doctor, we are in a relationship of power because the doctor is thought to possess expert knowledge. Dominant knowledge decided by experts are assumed to be whole truth, and this is caused to act in certain ways in a response. In this interpretation of power, power is dispersed and circulates throughout the society in a way akin to blood coursing through the capillaries. Note that Foucault chooses to use the term capillaries, the smallest of the body vessels, rather than the more straightforward imaginary veins, in order to emphasize the inner workings of power. In its most effective manifesto, the individual renders herself obedient, and is not necessarily conscious of the pervasiveness of power as a factor shaping and modelling her life choices. Foucault's approach reflects a wider trend in the modern analysis of power that refocuses upon effects of power rather than on a source. Traditionally, the holders of power and authority are usually considered to be led of state or government, but Foucault's understanding of social power shifts attention away from studying those apparently in power, by instead looking to uncover the ways that power is made and remade by localised settings and everyday relations. Power is thus not simply fixed in the institutional form of sovereignty over or government, but rather exists in social relations, in encounters with doctors, teachers, family members, colleagues, and friends, encounters threading through our daily practice. He, how might this work in practice? One example is a TV chef Jamie Oliver healthy eating campaign in British schools in the first decade, contestation as knowledge of healthy eating, established by scientific experts, was passed on to health head teachers and teachers, who in turn imposed it onto the rebellious dinner ladies, children, and parents. Common foods in the British diet took on new moral meanings. Chocolate chip, pizza, and pies were redefined as junk food, symptoms of irresponsible parenting and guilty conduct. Some have observed an eminent in social class judgment at play, according to the worldview of programs like Jamie's School. Dinners, the problem is largely cultural, not political or social. It doesn't consider that schools in deprived areas often lack enough money to feed children adequately, and in recent years have been required to feed children whose parents or carers do not have enough money to feed them well at home. Using breakfast clubs and school holiday meals, an issue popularised by the footballer Marcus Rashford. Nor does it consider that parents and carers in deprived households might lack the time, income, and taught skills to cook what are judged to be better. Often middle class associated meals, instead it comes down to what we preserve to be good or bad individual choices and values. Those who embraced the new diets were praised. Those who resisted, like the Rotherham parents, who smuck takeaway orders through school railings, were vilified, disciplined, and publicly shamed. Power has become effectively channeled and dispersed. Parents and children come to internalize the new social norms and police themselves. In the process, social power comes to legitimize and provide individualized explanations for problems that are often collectively shared and political in nature. Foucault isn't suggesting that we are equally implicated in the workings of power, or that power isn't deployed intentionally by actors and institutions. But what he is emphasizing is that in the modern world, power has shifted away from producers to seek to impose power from above and towards those that encourage us to exercise power over themselves and others. In essence, to take responsibility for our own domination. Individuals channel power through a complex mesh of relations. For instance, consider traditional gender stereotypes about children. Small boys are encouraged to wear blue, play with guns, and be aggressive. Jack the lad, while small girls are encouraged to wear pink, play with dolls, be meek, and never bossy. These norms are not imposed by governments or heads of state, but are often well meaning parents, grandparents, or carers. Thus, codes or general identity are transmitted and reinforced. Power relations are present in all social relations, but much of that power goes largely unrecognised. Power is more effective when it is not identified as power explicitly and when it is not simply saying no and acting to limit the freedom of individual. In his 1976 publication, Foucault argues that the power is tolerable only on condition that it masks a substantial part of itself. Its success is proportional to its ability to hide its own mechanisms. Thus, he contends social power is working to incite, reinforce, control, monitor, optimize, and organize the forces under it, a power bent on generating forces, making them grow, and ordering them, rather than one dedicated to impeding them, making them submit, or destroying them. Power shapes our understanding of what is normal and abnormal, true and false. They are simply perspectives that shape and drive our actions. As such, there are no factual, objective truths Rather, what's seen as is a product of power. What we hold to be true then shapes our actions and influences the actions of those around us. In this way, Foucault makes the case that social power involves entire populations acting on themselves and those around them, effectively bringing themselves to order. As such, social power sinks into the background of lived daily experience. The different views of power we examine present us with a range of ideas as to how power functions as both a positive, constructive, and productive force, as well as a negative force with potential to destroy, coerce, and oppress. Many changing ideas regarding to who has power and how it manifests itself in our everyday lives has been explored. These ideas have set out clear differences of opinion as to what power is, where it is located, and how we might come to identify. Power can be conceived as creative, destructive, but also as something which helps maintain a status quo. As we've seen, politics is both constrained and enabled by institutions, constitutions, and rights with liberal democracies in order to help overcome the tendencies of power to corrupt and be abused. Hannah Arendt suggests that power's capacity that belongs to people, especially in groups. Potential of power was seen in the example of the non-violent resistance to the British rule in India. And it demonstrates that power can often be effective and long-lasting when people act together. Stephen Luke's focus on power over a power possessed by people and sometimes evident in its exercise. His three dimensions of power set out different understandings of power: overt power, covert power, and power over thoughts and desires. Overt power was seen in workings of democratic politics in the US, where power can be observed in a concrete public decision that get taken. Covert power, the second dimension, is more difficult to locate, but can be found perhaps in the background deals between politicians and powerful multinational interests, keeping environmental issues away from the public gaze. The third dimension, power over thoughts and desires, looked at the extreme attempts to be taken by the Chinese government to keep its population from questioning authoritarian communist rule. It also considered to be a more subtle shaping of desires that political advertising seeks to achieve in liberal democratic societies. Finally, the discussion on Foucault's idea of social power focused more explicitly on the manner in which power is dispersed throughout the society and showed that power is an important feature of everyday social relationships. Chapter 7, Power, the conclusion, page 220. Now page 221, the final part of the conclusion. What is clear from all of the above discussion is that power is a concept of critical importance in the study of politics, and that we need to appreciate that difference of forms of what the operational power might involve. Chapter 8 will be the sovereignty. We're going to come into that on tomorrow.